All right, it's embargo day. Well, at least information embargo day when it comes to the 4060 Ti, which is the next logical release product for the stack of Ada Lovelace GPUs. It's kind of different this time around. We get to talk about some of the specs and stuff early, where normally we would have to wait until launch day. Either that means NVIDIA is trying to get ahead of any potential competitor releases that may or may not be happening on the same day as the 4060 Ti launch. But if you're a mainstream GPU enthusiast and you've been waiting to update or upgrade your 60 series card, this one might actually be a positive one. What's the matter? Oh.
How is anyone supposed to manage these cables?
Yeah, modern PCs feature a lot of fans, RGB components, and daisy chaining cables and connections everywhere, and it's made things really difficult to manage and keep together, which is why Corsair iCUE Link has something completely new coming.
Dude.
Okay, so Ada Lovelace, this is still the 4060 Ti is still an Ada Lovelace GPU. So there's kind of a lot to talk about here. They are smack dab going after the mainstream consumer with the 60 series graphics cards. Now, they're gonna be releasing two graphics cards in close succession to each other. So we have coming out in about a week, the 4060 Ti, and there are two variants of this card, by the way, which will make perfect sense in terms of the pricing stack with the 4070, 4070 Ti and all that, because I said there was a pretty big gap. They have an 8GB card and a 16GB card. There were rumors of being a 4060 Ti 16GB card, and that's absolutely true. Now, they tried to do something like this with the 4080. However, what's already different, we'll talk about this right off the bat, just at the front of the video, because of the fact that this is one of the things that I was worried about when we had our one-on-one call with NVIDIA, was great. A 16GB and an 8GB. What did you shave down off the 8GB? The only difference is specifically the memory allocation. There is no difference to the Cuda cores. There is no shaving of the Cuda cores, no shaving of the RT cores or the Tensor cores. It is core for core identical. What is different is going to be the amount of VRAM that is available to the card. And I asked them specifically, I said, so given the fact that the 4060 Ti is not targeted towards high resolution gaming, and by high resolution I mean like 4K gaming, it really is targeting that 1080p crowd. However, we've seen in the past, all the way back to the 2060 Super actually, which is this guy right here. And if you're still using this card, wait till you see some of the projected numbers. You're probably gonna highly consider an upgrade if you haven't been considering it. We don't test 4K with these cards, but they're very capable in 1440p, and they have been for the last couple generations. So I basically said, if you're targeting a 1080p crowd, why are you even giving the option of 16GB? Like, why are you even making your stack complex with having two extra SKUs? Because that extra 8GB of VRAM is gonna cost you $100 additional over the cost of a 4060 Ti 8GB. And it was pretty much an expected answer. It was just for those that are seeking more VRAM. There's this ideology out there that obviously certain titles and certain GPU intensive applications can benefit from the VRAM. So they wanted to have that option out there for those that needed it, but they're not shaving down the core for those that are not opting for that higher tier model, which is actually a positive thing. Remember the 4080 12 gig versus 4080 16 gig? Remember that whole thing? I'm glad that they changed their tune on that, and I'm not sure if this was already in the works and planned, or if this is something they somehow pivoted and changed as a result of the 40, because it's been like 7 months since the 4090 launched, and obviously the 4080 at the time of 4090 was announced to being the two SKUs. So I don't know how long it takes for this sort of change to happen, but it is a positive note, and we have to give credit where credit is due in the fact that NVIDIA is at least giving you the full die size of what the 4060 Ti was intended with the lower spec RAM. Fun fact, when they told us that there were two SKUs, I was like, okay, great. They're gonna more than, I said, which card is the Founders Edition gonna be? And I was, in my mind, I was 100% expecting it to be, oh, the 4060 Ti 16GB, the Founders card. Incorrect. The only Founders card is the 8GB card. The 16GB card is only available through AIC or add-in card partners. So that's your MSIs, your Gigabytes, your Asus, used to be EVGA, whoever is building graphics cards for NVIDIA, they're the only places you're gonna be able to get the 16 gigabyte card. So what this now looks like in terms of positivity, and I don't wanna jump the gun and get too positive on NVIDIA yet, because they have a habit of screwing up repeatedly, doing one or two things to make it look like they're becoming consumer friendly and then going back to their old ways. However, one of the biggest things that we've always complained about, and AIBs have also complained about, is the fact that they're in business against their own manufacturer. So if you have a manufacturer that's building cards that are designed to undercut you and you're a business partner, that's not much of a partnership, is it? Well, allowing the more expensive SKU to be the only one that AIBs, or the only AIBs are making it, kind of shows a little bit of at least a bone being tossed to the AIC partners or the add-in card partners, where they are the ones that'll have the more expensive SKU and maybe a little bit more profit for them to be able to have a viable business. So it's nice to see that. It also shows NVIDIA is actually putting its money where its mouth is, in the fact that in terms of the amount of VRAM available, with the exception of a few titles that really do benefit from that extra VRAM, they're putting all their eggs in this 8 gigabyte basket because it's still the same card, just with half the RAM. So anyway, moving on, I just want to get that out of the way, because in terms of being a good business partner, that's a good move. I feel like that's a good move for your partners. But anyway, it's got all the same features you would expect in a 40 series card. It's got DLSS 3, it's got the 4th generation Tensor cores, it's got 3rd generation RT cores, but it's kind of like, how do you take this mainstream card and make it better without having it cost a crap ton more? Well, first and foremost, let me go ahead and talk about cost. It is the exact same price that the 2060 Super was. It is the exact same price that the 3060 Ti was. So already generationally, where we've gotten kind of accustomed to the next generation costing more than the previous generation because you're getting more performance, but you're really just scooching the whole price per dollar or performance per dollar up as a bracket. You're not really getting more for your money, you're just paying more money for more, which is not an efficiency in terms of money being spent. The fact that it's the exact same cost as the 2 previous generations, and if you compare it to the 3060 Ti or the 2060 Super, and they didn't have a 2060 Ti, by the way, if you're wondering, it was the Super back then, it shows us that they're at least interested in increasing the amount of performance you're getting for the same dollar. This could have been the amazing love story that all of Ada Lovelace could have been if pricing had stayed somewhat consistent across the board with that. Now, the reason why, in terms of pricing, the 4070 is so much more at $599, because my fear when we saw the pricing of $599 for a 4070 was, I went, great. They're just upping everything $100 across the board in the mid-range, which means the 4060 Ti is gonna cost $499. Well, no, it's still $399, but the 16 gigabyte is what costs $499. So when I saw the pricing, I went, oh, okay, so that's where the gap is. It's that 16 gigabytes. To be honest, I don't personally feel like a 16 gigabyte card in a 60 Ti series is worth it. I would save the $100 and get an 8 gigabyte. Unless you know for a fact you are playing games that are highly gonna benefit from the bigger frame buffer, I wouldn't even go with the 16 gigabyte. But speaking of frame buffer, oh, and by the way, the 16 gigabyte model doesn't even come out till July. So the 8 gigabyte is the only thing you're gonna have available in May, and then you're gonna have to go the rest of May, all of June, and then into July before you're gonna see the 16 gigabyte model, which is also in July is when the 4060 non-Ti is gonna launch. So I don't personally feel like the 16 gigabyte model is gonna be worth the extra $100. I don't. Many of you in your use case or use scenarios may disagree with me, but personally for me, I don't feel like it's worth it. Now let's go and talk about shaders and teraflops. Teraflops is just what is the horsepower of the shaders or the Cuda cores that are in here? Like just raw performance, how many teraflops can it do? Well, it's a 22 teraflop card versus 16 and 7. So it's 3 times the teraflops of a 2060 Super for the same price. And let's face it, $499 or $399 in 2023 does not get you as much as $399 did back in 2018. So we've got some positivity here to at least look forward to. The RT core improvement is an extreme jump as well, because remember, this is 1st gen RT, this is 2nd gen RT, now we're in 3rd gen RT. 22 teraflops, 32 teraflops, 51 teraflops for the new card. Let's go ahead and talk about, well, the Tensor cores too, it's ridiculous. 57, 130, 353. So the tensor cores, remember tensor cores are what's responsible for all the DLSS3, the frame generation. That is a huge uplift in performance. Now, one of the things that might have people scratching their head when it comes to specs is gonna be the memory subsystem. 4 megabytes of L2 cache, 4 megabytes of L2 cache, 448 gigabytes per second, 448 gigabytes per second, but the 4060 Ti is 288 gigabytes per second. So already people are gonna look at that and be like, oh, so it's got less bandwidth in the memory than it does on the previous generations. No, because what you're seeing there is a normalized, if you will, versus the 4 megabyte cards. This has a 554 gigabyte per second effective, and the reason for that, these both have 4 megabytes of L2 cache. 4060 Ti has 32 megabytes of L2 cache. The reason why they have put a bigger cache pool on there is the fact that anytime the GPU core has direct access to information that exists in the cache, it's gonna be a much faster transfer rate than anything that takes place with having to go all the way to the VRAM. The same thing exists is for CPUs as it is GPUs, but GPUs probably are affected and benefit way more from having a bigger cache pool than you're gonna find on like CPUs. So it's 554 gigabytes per second effective because of the size of the L2 cache pool. So what you're gonna see right here is just kind of a dummy down version of like why cache matters. So you have what's called hits and misses when it comes to cache. When the core is like, hey, we need this information, if it doesn't exist in the cache, that's a miss. If it exists in the cache, that's a hit. So it'll just serve it to the core. It's off and running, you have low latency, high FPS, high processing. It's a very dumbed down explanation, but it's important for speed and latency. Any miss, it has to go to the VRAM to get. If the VRAM for some reason doesn't have it because it doesn't have a big enough pool or buffer pool, which means some of it has to then be stored in system memory, every time it has to go to another subsystem to access it, you have higher latency, slower performance. So by having a bigger L2 cache, which is the first cache that doesn't exist on the core directly, you have more opportunities for hits rather than misses. So it's kind of like, this time around for CPUs and even GPUs, because AMD has the Infinity Cache now that it exists on the GPUs as well. However, the Infinity Cache exists in an L3 versus L2. NVIDIA just going with a big L2, 32 megabytes on a 60 Ti card means that it's gonna have a much faster bandwidth in terms of memory than the standard 4 megabytes. So Phil and I were joking around like, in a perfect world, you have 16 gigabytes of L2 cache, but clearly that doesn't exist. It may someday, but it currently doesn't. So what you're getting is 8 gigabytes of VRAM or 16 gigabytes of VRAM. You're getting faster memory bandwidth. You're getting 32 megabytes of L2 cache. We're getting the Gen 3 RT cores, 4th gen tensor cores, DLSS 3, all for 160 watts. This is 200 watts for the 3060 Ti and 175 watts for the 2060 Super. So in terms of Leda Lovelace's like efficiency, although the 4090 appeared, even though it's a 450 watt card, overclocking it or pushing it to the limits went well over 500. It was scary looking like they just turned the knob to 20 when it comes to power draw. But no, the farther down the stack we went, the more efficient it became. In fact, this is a 12 watt idle power versus the 4060's 7 watt idle power. Even the 2060 Super is a 10 watt. So it is just kind of nuts on how efficient it is across the board. Now, one of the things I can't really speak to until we have the card and have done our own independent testing on performance uplift is how they compare to previous generations. But I can tell you right now, it's gonna be faster across the board and for the same amount of money at this point. If you were shopping for a 60 series tier card and you have, let's say all the way back to like a 1060, it's a no-brainer that if you have $399 to spend and you can get it for $399, it is gonna be an absolute monster of a graphics card for 1080p or for even 1440, even though it's not advertised for 1440. But what they're showing in their charts is versus a 2060 Super without frame gen, it's 1.6 times faster. So that's what, 60% more performance for the same price. That's a positive story. I know I sound like an NVIDIA fanboy at this point, but we've given them a hard time. And when they make changes or they make things, or decisions that are positive for the consumer, I'm gonna point that out. But when you turn frame gen on, which is a DLSS 3 feature, and although these cards can run DLSS 3, frame generation exists on 40 series cards because that's actually taking place at a hardware level. But once you turn on frame gen, you get 2.6 times the performance of a 2060 Super. This is a video we have coming later on, actually, not that far from now, where Phil's gonna do a deep dive on why this technology matters for your buying decisions and why we test with these features off to try and keep things on a level playing ground when we do horsepower testing with graphics cards. But how if you're not taking advantage of these features or at least trying to tune them, you're leaving a lot of performance on the table with very little, if any, noticeable fidelity hit to your graphics overall. So definitely stay tuned for that. But once you turn that on, 2.6 times the performance of a 2060 Super. Versus the 3060 Ti, it's 1.15 times faster, or 15% faster, CUDA core for CUDA core versus the 3060 Ti. Individually, that does not seem like a huge thing, but once you turn on frame gen, which of course the game has to support frame gen, not all games have it, it's 1.7 times faster. But even 15% more performance for 0% more cost is a positive story. Now, we'll just kind of look at a couple of charts here of 3060 Ti versus 4060 Ti, and once you turn on DLSS and all that, I mean, some of the charts just comedically go off the end of the chart, which again, is a positive thing because of the fact that more performance is important. Now, there are some titles that they were very open about. Not having 16 gigabytes of frame buffer did not give it nearly as much of a performance improvement over its predecessors than the 16 gigabyte model. And that's because there are titles out there that exist where you would need it, otherwise the card wouldn't exist at all. But these are things that we'll have to kind of test when we do our independent testing. So anyway, I wish I could tell you what some of the specs are gonna be specifically for like the CUDA cores and all that sort of stuff. But just to sort of continue the love story, they give us very little information about the 4060 non-Ti, but I can tell you compared to the 2060, they're saying 1.6x without frame gen and 2.3x with frame gen, and versus the 3060, 1.2 times and 1.7 times respectively with frame gen on or frame gen off. So you're looking at either a 60% uplift versus a 2060 or a 20% uplift versus a 3060. It looks like the raw uplift versus 3060 for a 4060 is a little higher than a Ti versus a Ti. So again, positivity, if we know this card exists, well, I say this card, I keep pointing here, knowing it's a $399 card, but still, the 4060 Ti is a $399 card. I'm gonna estimate the 4060 is probably gonna come in at about $349. Because we know once we get down to that lower level, they tend to only be about $50 gaps rather than 100. It'd be nice if it could be another $100 off, being like $299, pfft, that's a no-brainer. But that's not gonna be the case, because I don't think at that point there's any profit in there for them. So I'm thinking $349 realistically is what that card's gonna cost. If I look at previous pricing, let's see, RTX 3060 price, oh, it's $329. Okay, if they can keep that for $329, then that's a huge thing coming, where the 4060 would be a pretty awesome story, 4060 versus 3060 and 2060. But anyway, a lot of stuff to talk about here in the deck. We got a lot of things to go over. It's funny because they absolutely tout the 4070 Ti and the 4070 for 1440p gaming. I have no doubt the 4060 Ti will be able to do 1440p gaming above 60 FPS, no problem at all, especially with DLSS 3 and even with ray tracing on in certain titles. What's exciting about this time around, and if I sound like a fanboy, it's because I really am a fanboy of graphics technology. When the 2060 Super came out, we were like, this is cool and all. But back then, with the first generation RT cores and second gen Tensor cores and ray tracing not really being that widely adopted, and when you would turn it on, the performance hit was insane. Even in 1080p, turning on ray tracing with a 2060 Super was like cool for screenshots, but you didn't play games that way. But the 40 series, if all of this is true in terms of 4060 Ti performance, means you can finally afford a mainstream graphics card that doesn't cost more than a high-end gaming PC by itself and turn on all the features that make the game absolutely gorgeous without having 1/8 the frame rate. That's the story, and that's what we're looking forward to, especially as graphics enthusiasts around here. All right, guys, so that's the news. There were a lot of rumors on this, and all of the independent testing still has to take place, so make sure you subscribe to all your favorite tech channels to see what the end result ends up being. This one seems pretty straightforward and cut and dry. It's the same price. So there's none of this whole like, okay, it's this much more performance, but if we calculate this much cost difference and et cetera, what is the real price performance? It's as easy because the MSRP launch price is the same for all 3 generations. So it makes it super easy to calculate the improvements. Let's just hope there's enough to go around. A lot of people did not buy 4070 because 4070 just looked like it just seemed like a cash grab. And it costing $200 more than a 4060 Ti 8GB makes the 4060 Ti 8GB look like a real winner versus the 4070 for $200 more. Even the 16GB to me doesn't seem worth it. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Full review coming soon. As always, we'll see you in the next one.